Welcome back to Explaining Everything, the channel where we dive into the stories and mysteries behind everyday questions. Today's question comes from one of our space-loving viewers, Sienna Sky 55. Thanks for the suggestion, Sienna. You asked, where does space actually begin? It's a fascinating question. We all know space is out there, but where's the line between our atmosphere and the great beyond? Is there an official border, or is it just something we made up? Today, we're unpacking the science, history, and even politics behind this boundary to figure out exactly where Earth ends and space begins. So, if you've ever dreamed of being an astronaut or just wondered what defines space, stick around as we explore the edge of the final frontier, right here on Explaining Everything. Before we pinpoint where space begins, let's take a moment to appreciate why this is even a question worth asking. From the surface of the Earth, space seems infinitely far away, like a mysterious out there that doesn't affect our daily lives. But the truth is, space isn't as far as you might think. The concept of where space begins matters because it defines the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere, sets the stage for legal and political definitions, and even impacts how astronauts train and missions are planned. Essentially, this is the line where Earth's influence fades, and the vast emptiness of space takes over. But defining that line isn't as straightforward as it sounds. One of the most widely recognized answers to this question is the Kármán Line. Named after Theodor von Kármán, a Hungarian-American physicist and engineer, this imaginary boundary is located 100 kilometers, or about 62 miles, above sea level. That's roughly the altitude where conventional airplanes can no longer generate enough lift to stay airborne because the air is too thin. At this point, an aircraft would need to rely on orbital velocity, the kind of speeds spacecraft achieve, to stay aloft. In other words, the Kármán Line is where aerodynamics stop working and astronautics take over. This is why many organizations, like the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, FAI, recognize it as the official boundary of space. But here's the catch. Not everyone agrees with this definition. Some scientists argue that the actual transition from atmosphere to space happens much higher or lower than the Kármán Line. So, let's dig a little deeper. The atmosphere isn't a hard shell around the Earth. It's more like a collection of layers, each getting thinner and thinner as you go up. These layers include the troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, and the exosphere. Here's the thing. There's no sudden cutoff between these layers. For example, the exosphere extends hundreds of kilometers above the Earth and eventually transitions into space. But this transition is gradual, not abrupt. So does space begin at the top of the exosphere or somewhere in the thermosphere? It depends on how you define it. Interestingly, NASA and the US military consider space to begin at a lower altitude, 80 kilometers, or about 50 miles, above Earth. This is the point where the sky starts to look black and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible to the human eye. For decades, pilots of the X-15 rocket plane and other experimental aircraft earned their astronaut wings after crossing this 50-mile threshold. This discrepancy between the Kármán Line and NASA's definition highlights just how subjective this boundary can be. In reality, space is more of a concept than a physical line, and where we place that line depends on what we're trying to measure or achieve. Defining where space begins isn't just a scientific question. It's also a political one. International agreements, like the Outer Space Treaty, dictate that space is free for all nations to explore and cannot be claimed as sovereign territory. But here's the thing. The treaty doesn't specify where space actually starts. This ambiguity leaves room for interpretation, especially as more countries and private companies venture into space. Here's another twist. Even if we agree on where space begins, space itself isn't truly empty. The Earth's atmosphere technically extends thousands of kilometers into space, with trace amounts of gas particles lingering even beyond the orbits of satellites. This region, called the geocorona, was famously imaged by NASA's Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, revealing that the Earth's influence stretches farther than we thought. At the end of the day, the answer to where does space begin depends on who you ask and why the question is being asked. The Kármán Line, at 100 kilometers, is a convenient benchmark for many purposes, but NASA's 50-mile definition works just as well. Ultimately, space doesn't have a rigid starting point. It's a boundary we've invented to help us make sense of the cosmos. So next time you hear about someone crossing into space, take a moment to appreciate how arbitrary but fascinating that milestone really is. If you enjoyed learning about the boundaries of space, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the wonders of the universe. Also, if you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for tuning in, and join us next time here in the channel that answers all the why, what, who, where, and how questions you've always wondered about. Here on Explaining Everything.